Welcome to episode 28 of Rubbish Talk with myself, Alistair Meldrum.
And myself, Jane Bond.
Feels like ages, Jane.
I know. It was last year. Oh, was it?
It was last year. We've been cheating with episodes slightly because we had a couple of slightly different episodes, with the one that we recorded live at the CIWM Christmas lunch with Nina and Louise, and then we had our Christmas roundup, which we had a little bit of a quiz that some other presenter won, unfortunately.
Not that there was any competition. I think really everybody should go back and listen to that again. You know, just to I can revel in my win.
I'm sure there were answers that somebody had that somebody else didn't have, but that's just my suspicion. That's just my competitive nature, but never mind.
Just a poor loser, that's all.
Anyway, this week we have another interview with Simon Glen. Simon Glen was on episode 7, Rubbish Talk, which was probably early last year. We'll come on to what we'll cover with Simon. We've had a good chat with Simon about lots of things, as you would expect with Simon. But first of all, a couple of news items from what's been going on.
Yeah, we've got the Scottish Government and DEFRA consultation on the looking at the WEEE directive, and we've always kind of like gone on about the fact that about vapes and things like that. So this is actually trying to close that loop, I guess. It proposes to expand producer responsibilities to online marketplaces and distributors, and to ensure that producers of vapes properly finance recycling costs when they become a waste, which is great, because that's what we want to try and, well, we want to ban vapes to start off with. Well, some of us do, and then, you know, if not, get the producers to actually be paying all the you know, whoever's needs to actually pay for the disposal of these vapes and the recycling.
Yep. And it's not just the vapes, isn't it? It's all the electronic stuff,
and everything, yeah.
And all the as you say, all the online retailers that are escaping their liabilities at the moment, if you like. So that consultation's due on 7th of March, I think.
Yeah, 7th of March. Yeah, so there's plenty of time for people to get there to review it and get their ideas or their thoughts behind it.
I think it was quite interesting. It seemed to be pushed out between Christmas and New Year? It was during the Christmas period, because I spotted, I had the television on, and Scott Butler, our guest from episode 15, was on the news trying to explain what this consultation was about. And I think it was quite good timing from a public point of view, because I think the news agenda was quite quiet, but probably everybody got their Christmas gifts with their
electronics,
their headphones and their phones and their chargers and all these different things. So it did appear to get quite good coverage. So we'll have to wait and see.
It is quite interesting, because one of them required producers to fund a curbside collection for WEEE for households. So that could be quite interesting. You know, along with your 27 other bins, then we've got the WEEE bin as well.
It is quite interesting that it's going to be the producers that need to fund that and support that. So whether they are going to try and do that themselves, or whether they're going to try and tag on with local authority services. I do know there's some authorities that'll collect like a little bag of batteries or a little bag of WEEE along with certain collections, and they'd also do it for these coffee pods and stuff, you know, the coffee pod things. So there are a couple of authorities down south already doing that. So the systems do appear to be out there. So anyway, the next one we've got, I think we actually talked about this one, Jane, last time, but everybody probably was in their Christmas rush. So this is the SEPA waste permitting review, and I believe, somebody can maybe correct me, but I think the legislation's already been done for this, and really the consultation that's out at the moment is really how it's going to be implemented. So it's to do with the regulations around water, waste and industrial activities, and that consultation closes on the 31st of March. A confession from me, I've still not got around to reading it properly yet, so we'll maybe update in this one on future podcasts.
Yeah, we need to get our heads around it, don't we, and have a bit of a read. The other one I've got is about the fly tipping. So we had just like a blog looked like from Keep Scotland Beautiful. They were welcoming the fly tipping fine increase, which is good. So the fines increasing. Fixed penalty notice for fly tipping has raised from £200 to £500, which is still not massive when you look at the amount of fly tipping that is prevalent. Can't even say it. Prevalent in the country.
Well, half the time it's a cost. If you've got 5 ton of waste tipped to the side of the road, it's going to cost the council whatever more than £500 to actually remove it. What I would love to see in relation to fixed penalty notices is a publicly available, I couldn't even say that word, could I? A publicly available website or portal where the number of fines that are issued by authority or by body or whatever is put up there so you can see, because I think my understanding is the number of FPNs that are issued in Scotland are I'm not quite saying you could count them in one hand, but they're certainly not into the hundreds. So it's just trying to make that information available so people can see it's effective.
Yeah, I think there was something. SEPA put up something just recently on LinkedIn. I'm trying to find it, and they identified how much fixed penalty notices they had issued. I'm going to see if I can find it.
Was that not for their enforcement notices rather than fly tipping?
Yes, yeah. It was for theirs. Yeah, no.
Yeah. Well, if anybody does know of where that information lurks, then please let us know if it's already out there. That'd be great to know.
Yeah, it would be. Okay, and I've also got something as well that I was looking at, and I know this is probably negative news, but there was looking at the I was looking at the news, and there was another explosion caused by car batteries or a car battery recycling plant, which was really it was such a shame, because it looks like the fire was on the 2nd of January, and you think, crikey, they've only just got started and there's another fire, and it was in Wolverhampton, and yeah, so it just kind of shows. It was reported 6 fire engines and around 30 firefighters attended the scene, which no injuries fortunately, but this is the second fire since the facility has opened, and I guess it just shows the importance of fire safety and the risk from batteries, I suppose, really.
Yeah. So this is them looking at trying to recycle lithium-ion batteries from LEVs effectively. So yeah. I think this is one of the huge issues we've got, looming, that we're putting huge amount of work into, ELV, like cars, electric trucks, but we're putting next to no effort and work into how we actually recycle these things. And there's a huge lack of capacity in this sector, and I think it's quite challenging for the companies that are actually trying to do the battery work. That is how does it fit within the current regulations, and how do they do it safely?
And it's recycling and getting that lithium back out again, and how you can get the lithium back out to be able to make another, battery, and it's just trying to close that circular economy thing, isn't it? Trying to recover the lithium to make another battery.
Yeah. And then the other news we spotted was Wales seems to be leading the way on mattress recovery. So mattresses are a huge issue for the waste sector just because of their makeup. And if you remember, we had a good chat with Robin Stevenson from Hamilton Waste in episode 13, where they had a good process based in Scotland for recycling, recovering mattresses. Interestingly enough, Hamilton Waste very recently, just before Christmas, were sold out to Biffa. So I'm assuming Biffa is going to keep that service ongoing. I've not heard otherwise, but it looks like Wales is leading the way. And interestingly, Wales seems to be quite proactive in the whole household waste recycling agenda. They seem to be quite forward thinking in terms of how they manage the waste. Because they're quite often appearing in the top list. So
it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because I suppose a lot of the recycling is all dependent on demography, isn't it? How many, what you've got, how many rural areas you've got, how many big conurbations you've got, and things like that. So I guess it'd be interesting to compare Wales with Scotland to see what the demography or what the difference is. Obviously, Scotland's a lot bigger and a lot, yeah. So yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
And I was looking at something as well, and there is a thing about old green street cabinets. These like green scabby cabinets that tend to be, stickers put on them and all that sort of stuff that are were storing all sorts of cables for your what do we call it, your phone lines and BT and the cabling and everything like that. And they're going to try and turn those into power banks for electric vehicles. So that kind of comes back onto electric vehicles. And it's part of a pilot plant starting in East Lothian, Scotland. So I thought that was quite interesting. Although when I'm thinking about these things, there all seems to be the opposite side of the pavement to what you want them. So I'm not quite sure how that'll work, but it'll be interesting to see.
I noticed the one they used, the photo was right beside the curbside, which would be ideal to get a couple of plugs. But I presume if the wall side of the curb, if they're far away from the curb, I presume what they're going to do is just use the power that's coming into that box and then route it to a post or something beside the curb.
It'd be a bit of a health and safety issue if you're kind of trailing your cables over it, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Imagine.
I hadn't actually picked up it was East Lothian that was starting the trial first. Actually, I hadn't realised that. So that's good.
Yeah. Well, it's 60,000 street cabinets across the UK could be used to do that, which would be brilliant if you could do it, because the lack of it's fine having your electric vehicles, but if you haven't got anywhere to charge them. Yeah,
it's quite hard. It's quite hard getting a public point at the moment. It's quite tricky, and that's only going to get worse as more people have electric vehicles. It's going to get worse and worse. So, yeah, big challenge coming. So I think that's plenty of news for us to start the year. A couple of Albion updates. We've been keeping pretty quiet about this one because we weren't allowed to announce it because it wasn't quite official. But we have, well, first of all, South Ayrshire Council bin app. We have been contracted to run that for another 3 years, so that's great news. So I've got my 6 bins, and I get my wee reminder when my bin needs done and so on because I've got the app. But we've also just launched a similar bin app for Dundee Council, and it was quite an interesting one because they produce bin calendars every year, and they were really keen for a QR code to go on it with the bin app. But the problem was the timing wasn't quite right. That the calendars had to go out before Christmas for the start of the year, but the collection was disrupted over Christmas and New Year. So they were a bit wary of having this bin app that was going to start and then maybe not, the collections weren't going to match up. So officially, although it was available for public download before Christmas, officially it started at the start of this week. So residents of Dundee, if you've not downloaded your bin app, just go to your iStore or your Google Store, whatever it's called, and search for Dundee bin app, and you will find it. You can set your reminders for when your bins are. You can set your reminders from when your elderly parents or your relatives get their bins as well. And it's got links back to, you can link into all the council website in terms of reporting missing bins and missed bins and all that type of stuff. So all really positive. It did hit the local papers before Christmas, and I think the papers were fishing for a bit of a negative story, but people that had downloaded the app went on and said no, the app's great, it's fine. So the negative story was sort of quietly dropped. The one that made me laugh slightly was somebody was complaining, what's wrong with a calendar that I can stick in my fridge? It only costs the price of a stamp. And what that resident's forgetting is there's 70,000 residents in Dundee, so there's 70,000 stamps to get a calendar out to everybody, whereas the app can be rolled out, it can be in people's phones, it doesn't particularly need updated every year, and it also allows the council to communicate back with the residents. So all good. Lots of thanks to Charlie Devine, who we had on. We're calling out loads of people from previous podcasts today, Jane. Charlie Devine from episode 16. He's the one at Dundee Council that's been coordinating that. So that's all been good. So hopefully there's going to be a bit of a PR launch and a bit of publicity about that over the next coming weeks. So all good. And if anybody is interested in a bin app, doesn't know what it does or whatever, there is a My Bins website, or find it through our website, or get in touch, and we're quite happy to have a call with yourself to run through how it works.
Yeah, so come on, East Denfrewshire, we need a bin app. I need to be reminded of when my bins go out, rather than having to run out and look at everybody else's bins. Yeah, so, and to be fair, we're not doing too badly this, and we've got a couple of job adverts out, haven't we, Alistair? Looking for some staff. So again, if you're thinking new year, you're thinking you might move into consultancy, then give us a shout, because we're looking for staff. Hopefully it'll be on LinkedIn quite soon, and we'll provide links to it on our show notes as well. So again, if you're looking for a job, there we go.
Yep. Two roles up at the moment, and we will link, as Jane says, in the show notes. One is for senior consultant, and the other one is we do a lot of WAMATAB training and assessment work, and we generally keep it to quite a tight pool of assessors we use, but we're looking to widen that pool a little bit. So if you're doing that type of work or interested in that type of work, by all means, get in touch. So I think that's plenty news from us. I think the only thing we're just going to say, we have got an interview with Simon Glen. We did actually record this prior to Christmas, and prior to some official government announcements and stuff. So I don't think there's anything particular that's outdated, but I know there was one particular thing Simon talked about, the emission trading scheme, that the next day the government announced something about cross-border accounting processes and stuff. So we had a good chat with Simon, largely about emission trading scheme and the impact that's going to have on the waste sector, and his views about plastic and carbon and reducing carbon. And we probably extended wider that into how we've got all these environmental challenges. How do we actually get the public to engage with these things when potentially it's going to hit them in the pocket and they're not going to like it? So good chat with Simon, and Simon has also very kindly put together quite a long blog about some of the stuff we chatted about. So that's also available up on the Rubbish Talk page if people want to have a look at that. The interview and the blog posts probably complement each other if people want to have a look. So I think that's us, Jane.
Yeah, I think so. On to Simon.
Welcome back to Rubbish Talk. We have a special guest, Simon Glen from Natural Capital Analysis. Now, Simon, the ones regular listeners to the podcast will remember Simon from episode 7 of Rubbish Talk. So how are you doing, Simon?
I'm doing very well. I'm doing better than I was last time. I think I had COVID when
you
we
did
the last one.
That's right, you did actually. You did.
Yeah, so that I think that's why it went on for so long, and it was a bit of a fever dream. But no, doing much better today, thank you.
You were just so up in the rankings, Simon. You are just top dog.
I can't imagine. Well, I'm very appreciative. I can't imagine why that is.
No,
But, no, thank you very much.
You regularly, I think most of 2023, you were the top running podcast. But I am catching you up. Actually, I am slowly trying to chip away at your lead, Simon. So you never know. You never know. And Jane has been creeping up the rankings as well. So
well, that's why I'm doing it. That's why I'm doing it.
I've been doing lots of training, you see, and I've been telling them all, right, you need to listen to this Rubbish Talk episode 12. Right. Not that as a plug or anything.
And she's been handing out these wee stickers we've got as well, so that's all good. So this episode is going to be slightly different from the normal, that we're not following a set of questions. What we're going to do is we're going to run through a series of topics that Simon is going to do his best to explain to us, and then hopefully myself and Jane are going to ask some sensible, or maybe not sensible, questions to try and pick Simon's brains. So over to you with the first one, Simon.
Well, yeah, I mean, thanks very much for having me back on. I can't imagine that anybody wants to listen for another hour to this voice, but no, I'm very appreciative.
Someone actually said to me, Simon, that they actually like listening to your voice. And I can't actually remember who it was.
Well, it's nobody that I live with, I can tell you that much.
I think you should do audible books, actually, Simon. You've got a very good sort of listening to voice.
Well, the only comment I get back last time was that everybody was amazed that I could last that long without swearing. So, but I'm happy to be back. For those that don't know who I am or what we do, I've been in the waste resources, renewables game for 23 years now, coming up for 24. And at the moment, myself and Tim Reid run two consultancies. One is Natural Capital. Natural Capital looks more these days at infrastructure, energy from waste, anaerobic digestion, plastics recycling facilities, and so on. The Gather business, a lot of people will have seen the waste compositional analysis work coming out that Tim worked on. A lot of the Gather work is more enabling works like that, more the analytical works that might be done with Zero Waste Scotland, Scottish Government, RAP, and so on and so forth. So that's the kind of work that we do. The first topic I thought we could discuss together is something that's not being discussed enough, in my opinion, and that is the ETS. And I know you'll want me to say what that is. That's the emissions trading scheme. And just how high on the radar is the emissions trading scheme for yourselves? Does it come into dialogue, not come into dialogue?
Not really.
I had to Google it, Simon, to work out what it was.
Yeah, given that me and Alistair were going, ETS, what does that stand for? I think you probably need to explain it quite a bit, Simon.
Sure. So I'm going to explain it, but I want to just explain why I'm concerned about it. And I'll try and do this as quickly as I possibly can, because what I'm noticing more and more as I get older and as we work in this industry a wee bit more is that we tend to be doing things in a vacuum, and we tend to be making policy and enacting policy in a bit of a vacuum without a broader understanding of how that might affect people in the real world. So this is a very, very brief history of how we got here, as fast as I possibly can. And as soon as I say 1945, you're going to say, how far is this going back? But 1945 to the mid-70s, after the Second World War, we had shortages in the supply chain of just about everything and concerns about post-war depression just about everywhere. And so most of the major economies, including the UK, implemented this big, broad economic policy of full employment. So full employment was the big idea, and the big idea was to keep people away from bad ideas. Because if you looked at the previous 40 years, what it was is bad ideas. So whether you want to talk about the fascism of Nazi Germany, the communism of Stalin's Soviet Union, bad ideas, right? And that lasted pretty well until the 70s. And there was a lot of technical reasons for that, and you can go and look at the technical reasons about why that was a better idea, but it was to improve the standard of living of people and keep them away from bad ideas. Obviously, by funneling a lot of money into it, there was a lot more production, people's standard of living rose, products came onto the market that we didn't previously have, and so it started a kind of standard of living that we would become used to, particularly in things like household appliances and so on and so forth. That was fine until the 70s, and in the 70s inflation grew, the interest rate soared, economic growth was anemic, and basically Labour was taking too much of the money home, capital went on strike, you had stagnant economies and inflation, so you had the stagflation of the 70s, and bad ideas reared their head again. So in the 80s, what do we end up with? From 1980s to 2008, we had this big idea called price stability. Price stability was basically the fundamental macroeconomic policy that gave you globalization. Mass market deregulation, price stability necessitates that you take the means of production and you put it where it's cheapest so that you get very cheap goods produced all around the world that can then come into markets that have had their financial deregulation that allows people to get credit, allow people to buy homes upon which to base their credit. And so you had this large kind of growth of the kind of consumption that we see now as being a standard part of our standard of living. What you ended up with in there was a lot of house price inflation, a big asset base, you could borrow more and more, you could engage in high levels of conspicuous consumption. And that became kind of endemic in our sort of national identity, really. And we did have small sort of recessions in the 90s. These things were interest rates and so on. But that built up and built up to the point where you have these low-cost economies elsewhere flooding the Northern European and Western markets with low-cost goods, and us enjoying that because that's how we kept ourselves away from bad ideas again. Consumption is really the thing that replaced full employment. The problem is that since the financial crash, you're still somewhat in the blast radius of the financial crash, right? And we don't have anything else to replace it currently. And what you'll notice is that people they fall left and they fall right. They don't fall in the centre ground. And so that's why you kind of have this politics that you have just now. And you might be asking, well, how is that relevant to what we're talking about? And the reason that it's predominantly relevant to what we're talking about today is that there is a number of surveys that people are quite willing to take on board measures that will affect climate, as long as it doesn't cost them any money. It's no surprise that if you look at the Dutch elections and Geert Wilders winning, what did Geert Wilders stand on? More fossil fuels, they're cheaper, canning turbines and solar, abolishing all the Dutch climate policies, leaving the Paris Agreement, claiming that the measures that are being implemented that are costing people money in electricity are quote, pointless climate hobbies. And so you have that with the Republicans in America, you have that here with Reform UK, you have it now in Argentina, you have it in France with Le Pen, and you have it in Italy with Meloni. So that when I'm talking about this, what I want everybody to kind of understand is when I say I'm concerned about it, I'm concerned about the fact that the policies that we're enacting are going to be very unpopular and are going to cost money. And the issue is that we have an election next year. And not just us. In the democratic world, there's 6 billion people, and 2 billion of them are going to the polls next year. That's the shorter prefaces I can give. But if I tell you something like the ETS is an emissions trading scheme. So we've had an emissions trading scheme in Europe for quite some time. Obviously, we left Europe. And this is the replacement for that. An emissions trading scheme is basically a cap in trade. So the whole economy has a cap, an amount of emissions that is allowed. And called allowances, and each allowance is equal to 1 tonne of CO2 equivalent. That cap drops year on year on year. Within that cap, you get a certain proportion of that for free. So free allowances, the ability to freely pollute. In 2022, that was 36% of the total allowances were free allocations.
So does that mean, sorry, Simon, does that mean like if you had, it was at 34 to 35% per industry or per overall, or does it not matter?
Overall, free allowances are distributed to different organisations. So within the UK ETS at the moment, there's about 470 organisations who are captured within it. And 27% of the free allowances go to 2 companies. So steel, basically, steel production. That ETS has now been agreed to be extended to energy from waste. Energy from waste will now be captured within the UK ETS. So what does that mean for our listeners, our colleagues, our friends? What it means is that if you supply waste to an energy from waste plant and it has a proportion of fossil carbon, the ETS is based on emissions from fossil carbon. So plastic. What it means for local authorities in particular is that local authorities, likely due to the nature of the contracts, are the ones that will pay the ETS price. So you might get 30% in free allocations as an energy from waste plant, but 70% of that needs to be secured by auctions, buying allowances. And there's a fluctuating price because it's a free market, it's a fluctuating price. So the price last year was anywhere between £60 a tonne and £90 a tonne. So if you are, say, a large council and you have 100,000 tonnes going to an energy from waste plant and 25% of that is fossil carbon, then the likelihood is you are going to have a bill that could be anywhere between 3 million, 6 million pounds per annum.
Wow.
Now, it's not getting talked about.
I'm just thinking it's going to drive stuff back to landfill, Simon, because it's going to be cheaper to landfill than.
So there is the case for landfill, but you'd need to separate out the material given the landfill ban.
Yeah.
So here's the facts about it that I find really interesting. When the proposal was made and the consultation happened, only 20% of respondents said no to an ETS for energy from waste. Now, if it was calculated out and it was shown how much that would cost, I'm fairly certain we would have had a different result. I also think that the respondents, 97% of respondents said that the waste contractor will pay these through costs. So whilst it's based on a kind of polluter pays principle, that works in the ETS if you are, let's say, a cement manufacturer and you're using fossil fuels to manufacture that cement. That's sensible because you can change your fuel input, perhaps you can use an SRF, you could use something like that. In waste, the plant is not in control of what is supplied to it outside of the standard metrics of the fuel supply agreement and the fuel specification. So it makes sense that the local authority or the commercial contractor pays for that tax, the ETS. But I think it's been misunderstood how much this is going to cost. And as I've said before, people are quite willing to support these kind of measures unless it costs them lots of money.
So that's interesting. So all these waste composition analysis stuff that we've all been doing, you know, and we were looking at taking out recyclables. Realistically, the information's there to say, right, Council A, Council B, you've got 25% plastics now in your waste stream that isn't being taken out. Either this is going to cost you 60 to 90 pounds a tonne, and I'm presuming that's 60 to 90 pounds a tonne of waste, not plastic.
No, so that's the carbon price. So that's the price per tonne of CO2 emitted. The interesting bit about how far away we are from knowing how much this will cost in practical reality is that you need to then calculate out how many kilograms of CO2 equivalent per tonne per kilogram of plastic burned. Now, where does that become even more interesting? It becomes more interesting because if you look at PVC, PVC is only 50% carbon. HDPE is 80% carbon. So our waste analysis is actually considerably more valuable than we think it is. The emittance of carbon from burning, is it 2 kilograms per kilogram? It might be. Right? So 2 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of plastic burned. That might be a number. It might be 3, it might be higher than that. But what I'm trying to get across is, I know a council that spends about £27 million on third-party payments, gate fees, right? And that's its annual budget. It's like £27 million for annual gate fees. It may well end up having to spend an additional £4.5–5 million a year simply for the pass-through costs of ETS.
Wow, that's a bit scary.
Okay, now you look at that for all the Scottish authorities, then all the English authorities also. And you start to put that in the frame of where we are in terms of budget cuts and the announcement that's going to be made tomorrow with regards to the settlement for councils. That has been described to me. Shona Robinson's settlement for councils tomorrow has already been described to me by someone in the know as breathtaking.
So what's the timescales for this, Simon?
That's exactly what I was going to ask you.
So we will need to start gathering the data 2026 and 2027 with full implementation about 2028.
Looking for a silver lining here, Simon. I'm thinking that waste composition analysis will be even more important than it already is.
Well, if you wanted me to make it any more complicated, if you want to do an industrial carbon capture project, you need to use what's called the C14 method of determining carbon emissions. However, that's not suitable if you've got 4 or 5 local authorities who all have different front ends going into the same facility. Because your allocation back to them of the pass-through cost has to be relative to the amount of fossil carbon they give you.
Okay, this is going to be, oh wow.
Is there going to be a system for calculating that, Simon, or is it going to be like the landfill ban where we've got, in theory, we've got a test, but nobody can actually analyse for the test?
This is the reason that I'm bringing it up. The reason I'm bringing it up is, first of all, I will say, I think it's an abysmal idea. I think it's a shocking idea. I don't think it should have been implemented. I think we didn't understand what it was when we were doing the consultation responses. As I say, if you try and implement something like this and everybody agrees, what you'll find is that you've simply, because it's a market mechanism, you've simply introduced another revenue line for the larger organisations. It's no surprise to me that the larger energy from waste plants have decided that they're the ones that are going to do carbon capture, because they can, number one, afford it, and number two, it will give them a lot of carbon credits carbon allowances to trade. it's £60 to £90 a tonne, notwithstanding the secondary market for carbon futures, etc., etc. I personally think that it will end up costing householders, whether it's now or whether it's later. I think it's unsustainable, the level of cost, and I would have preferred greatly that we just banned plastic from the residual bin.
So would that have been, you know, we're talking about the issues and the problems here, so what would be, how do we deal with it? How do we manage it? Would that be the best way of doing it?
Well, banning plastic from the residual bin has a couple of net benefits. First of all, one of the things that we're struggling with at the moment in terms of providing infrastructure is the distribution of plastics between different systems. So we've decided to have DRS that will take PET, and our PET is a very valuable commodity in the market. Not right now, of course, because the plastic markets are all over the place, but that's for external sort of macro reasons. That market will resolve itself eventually. But PET goes out to that market. HDPE currently sits within the local authority treatment market. We're going to bring in EPR. EPR will start to bring in different polymers out to a different sort of financial market. What we need is a way of capturing all those polymers and starting to see what it is that we can work with to derive value. Because as we might get onto later, DRS will cause a dent in local authority revenues. EPR will provide a certain amount of money back to local authorities through the full net cost of recovery. But if you can vastly increase the amount of that EPR type material, one, you end up with more money from EPR because you're recovering more material. And secondly, we start to see more clearly what it is that we have to deal with the flexible plastics, with the cosmetic ridges, if you like. But also, it simply stops the emittance of fossil carbon from what will now be the residual technology of choice.
So that's all well and good, you know, say we ban this plastic from residual bin, we've collected it from everywhere else. But what do we do with it? Because there's no, you know, where's the processing capacity? I mean, it's still going abroad? You know, where's it going?
Well, we're going to have export bans reasonably soon. So we've started out with doing export bans to non-OECD countries. I do think we'll probably end up, regardless what flavour of politician we'll end up with in Westminster, probably a ban on sending waste out of the country. The reality is that, as you know, I've been involved in energy from waste and AD, for example, since 2005. And from 2005 until 2010, 2011, 12, 13, nobody was interested. And so what stimulated the development of AD plants? Food waste collections. What stimulated the development of energy from waste in Scotland? The landfill ban. So it's not the case that the market will identify an opportunity and then go to 32 authorities and around about 41 commercial companies and say, hey, we're thinking about doing this. How about you implement a new service? It simply can't work that way. What you have to do is you have to generate the supply first. And if you can generate the supply first, the technology and the facilities always follow. The technology is there, but we need to generate the supply and we need to make it into a viable proposition for folk.
Going back, Simon, to the energy for waste plants. Why are they just taking the view they're just going to pass this cost on to their customer and therefore they're not
really caring about it? Is that the...
It's not that they're not caring about it. And I would argue the fact that, so I work with a lot of energy from waste developers and a lot of energy from waste plants, and I think they get a bad rap as being that they don't care about the environment or they don't care about the emissions. That's not true at all. Almost every energy from waste plant that I've worked on, is very careful about this sort of thing. But they are responding to policy. That's all that's happening. They're just responding to policy. I mean, it's interesting to me that anaerobic digestion plants don't get the same feedback as energy from waste plants, when essentially, like if you're an AD plant that is generating a biogas and then putting it through a CHP, you're essentially using natural gas. CH4 is CH4, right? Yeah. So we can't get beyond the sort of chemistry and physics of the thing. So they do care, but the reality is that almost every feedstock supply agreement, the change of law is on the supplier's side. It's not on the operator's side, which means that if there's a change in law that prevents the supplier from providing a type of fuel, or that there's additional cost to that fuel or whatever, it sits on their side. And most people know that. Like I say, in the consultation response, 97% said the waste contractor will pay those pass-through costs. And 66% said they were absolutely certain that their change of law provisions would be enough. And so the reason that I put that preface about how we got here is that when we have these kind of policies, we've spent the last sort of 80 years almost keeping people away from bad ideas by giving them a type of life that is consistent with their impression of their standard of living that they should have, and that any impact to that standard of living is treated in a very negative way. And what you're seeing now, not just in the UK, but across Europe and in America, is that when we start implementing policies that cost people money, they tend not to believe what it is that we're trying to get across. They tend to believe the opposite, because they're not interested necessarily, and you can't blame them for this, they're not interested in sort of the factual communication of how the climate works and how sort of emissions generate global warming. They're more interested in somebody who will come along and say, I think this is nonsense and it's costing you a lot of money. There's an easier way to do this. And my concern is that something like the scale of impact that the ETS will have on local authorities who are having their budgets cut, and bear in mind that the ETS money goes back to the Treasury, I can't see it playing well. And I am genuinely concerned about how this plays out with people.
And then how does
do you think I'm overreacting?
I think from listening to what you've explained, we've effectively going to have a tax on waste energy facilities in future years, and that as somebody that's in the waste industry, I've not been aware of any communication about a tax on the waste energy sector, which is effectively what it is.
Well, they are pitching it as a tax on the waste energy sector, but they won't be paying the tax. So it's a tax on waste supply that contains fossil carbon.
Yep.
Because the producer pays again, isn't it?
So yeah, so it's the producer of what? So if you're talking about the producer of the carbon emissions, that's the plant, but it's the producer of the fossil waste, that's the authorities. The difference is that it becomes asymmetric. And we had already done quite a lot of work for our national experts on waste and Scottish Government to say that the asymmetry of carbon taxes is a massive problem. So what do I mean by asymmetry? What I mean is that one of the biggest fuel providers through to energy from waste plants across the UK will be, let's say, Biffa. So if Biffa as a supplier have to pay the carbon tax, the ETS, they are able to redistribute that cost to their customers, their commercial customers. You can't do that as a local authority because we don't have pay. You're stuck with it. We don't have pay as you throw. So you are limited in what you can do. And in Scotland, we seem to be continuing with our council tax freeze. So we have a council tax freeze. We have a £1.5 billion funding gap already for local authorities. We've been told that the announcement tomorrow will tell us that in local authorities or in the public sector generally, the workforce is going to have to shrink. They have a legal duty. So again, might not be something that a lot of listeners know. A local authority has a legal duty to produce a balanced budget each year. Obviously, they can't go bankrupt as such, but they can put a section notice in. And what I'm really interested in is looking at the scale of the impact of say something like the ETS, its impact on local authorities, and asking who was it. You can say it the Treasury, you can say it Scottish Government, you could say it RAP, Zero Waste Scotland, anybody else that seemed to be in favour of all of this. Who aligned the service demands of this with finance?
So in effect, really, we either need to, well, like you say, ban plastic residual waste, find an alternative to plastics. We need to try and, how do we move that plastics? Because, I mean, we've looked at waste composition analysis and we know there's loads of plastic still in the waste stream, even though there's curbside collections. But the curbside collections don't include all, some of them are now including, but not a lot of them include the flexible plastics. So you look in your bin and there's so much flexible plastics in there. You've got all your packaging, you've got all your your film that goes on the top and all that sort of stuff. So I guess and that is what is more difficult to process. And I guess what you've also got is your plastic containers or whatever are going to be full of food and mess and God knows what else. So processors don't want that mess. So I guess it's how do you go from all that plastics in the bin when there's curbside collection to no plastics in the bin, so the local authority can collect that plastic and get the money rather than having to pay out. What do we do?
I mean, I can give you my opinion, and I'm
go
pretty
for
sure
it.
Yes, well, that's what we
go for it, Simon.
I'm pretty sure my colleagues in sort of local authorities and in the processing sector are going to be up in arms about what it is I'm going to say. However,
once you do that, Simon, I'm going to throw something else into the mix as well, just to,
okay,
which may align with what you're going to say or not. I don't know.
Well,
just listen, have a whip round.
Listen, if we're planning to have a DRS, which apparently we're all planning to have a DRS, whether it's an all UK, whether it's a Scotland only, whatever it is, there will be an amount of material going from the. I live in Inverclyde, so it would be going from my blue bin. It will be leaving my blue bin. That creates an amount of capacity within each container. The thing that was very frustrating looking at the business models for the DRS is that they seem to suggest that because you collect less material, it costs you less per tonne to collect. When the inverse is true, obviously, the costs of collection stay the same. A vehicle, some fuel and 3 or 4 guys costs the same whether you're collecting a tonne or 100 tonnes. It doesn't make a difference. The cost per tonne might be different, but the actual cost doesn't. My understanding is, from the work that I've done on it so far, is to say that if the amount of waste leaving the bin is equal or equivalent to the amount of polymer that sits in the residual bin, and you can replace one with the other simply by having a direction to householders to say, if you think this is made out of plastic, put it in your recycling container. One, you should maintain, theoretically, give or take, the kind of costs that you have just now in terms of collection. It shouldn't really be any different if these things are weight equivalent. Secondly, the idea that the facilities are not there to separate out the material, you're never going to have any progress in the facilities until you start trying to collect the material. The Serico site is a great example of that, and the flexible plastics that they were collecting. So yes, was there an issue with the final processor of the material? Yes, there was an issue there, but they work on behalf of large chains, you know, Procter & Gamble, for example, collecting that material. That will become the norm over time as EPR steps in, is that there will be a sponsoring by the bigger brands, the Unilevers of the world, to say, hey, if you guys go and do this flexible plastic collection, yes, there's a payment through EPR, but also what does it do for their ESG? What does it do for them in the broader market?
ESG?
So environmental social governance. It allows them to say, hey, not only are these things being collected, but we are actually sponsoring the collection and getting involved in it at the ground level. The way out of a lot of this, and I hasten to say this because people will know that I'm entirely apolitical until it comes to political economics and sort of how things should work. You can throw a lot of money at this, right? It might be private money, it might be private equity, but private equity pretty much owns most of the assets and infrastructure that you think exist anyway. So the energy from waste plants, the AD plants, etc., etc. Anything that created a stable revenue, so energy, stable, relatively stable revenue, pretty much all of that is private equity money and owned by private equity. What I'm suggesting is that if you generate the supply, the conditions for funding and the conditions for processing will come afterwards. That's kind of where I am with it, because the other option is basically business as usual. Authorities will get charged an awful lot of money to do this within the ETS, and that will inevitably have a result back on, whether it's now or whether it's later, council tax or pay as you throw or other charges, undoubtedly. And what do you do there? You start to diminish and harvest away positive public sentiment to the sort of things that we're trying to do.
The one I was going to throw in, Simon, was I was with a contractor last week, and they're handling what we would call twin stream recycling for the councils. So the councils of Scotland have split, you know, the Rishi Sunak's 7 bins idea, if you like. So you know, instead of having a commingled bin, we've now got a bin for paper and card, and then we've got a bin for generally hard plastics and metals, you know, aluminium cans.
Yeah,
they're now tendering for these contracts, and they're probably paying back to councils anything between, you know, £30 and £70 a tonne back to the councils. So potentially there's a revenue going back to the councils of, you know, can be fairly significant, you know, hundreds of thousands of pounds.
Yeah.
And going back to, you know, the sort of waste comp stuff Jane mentioned earlier, we know there's still a pretty big chunk of that type of material in a residual bin.
Yeah. So
there's actually there's an earning opportunity for the councils in there. But what they were pretty clear about was some of the councils have allowed soft plastics into the bin. And they're like, if you put soft plastics in, we're not going to pay you anywhere near £70 a tonne. We're going to pay you £10 a tonne, or maybe not even pay you at all, because, you know, we can't. One, it's harder for us to process that material, and 2, there's not really any outlets for that material. You know, I'm just looking at, you know, Viridor Polymers plant has lost 29 million. You know,
and we had the other one for 5, and that didn't.
Yeah,
that's not flowing either.
In the UK, these plants have not have not particularly flown very well in terms of, and that might change if there's a ban on export and all that sort of stuff, and that might drive that market.
It may. So why are plastics facilities losing money? Plastic facilities are losing money for a number of reasons, particularly now. And the plastics market just now is very, very difficult, but it's very, very difficult for a number of different reasons. One being the price of virgin polymers, right? So the price of virgin polymers crashed, and so it's very difficult to place secondary polymers. The other thing is the lack of regulation within the market. I would suggest gently that the PERN system, it has some issues with fraud. I also think that we misunderstand greatly what the job is. Like, so what's the job with plastics? Unlike any other waste stream that we deal with, the ability to get plastics, and we talked about it in the last podcast, but the ability to get plastics to an end of waste allows you to hold that as an asset as opposed to a liability on your balance sheet. Right. So the first thing is with the job, are we able to kind of invest in facilities where the MRF itself may well have an end of waste processing facility on the back of it? Is it possible? I was at one in 2005. Just as you were saying, Jane, about the quality of the plastics and the food contamination. JFC Delieve in St Helens was already doing hot washing and pelletization and stuff in 2005. These things are not new, and they get done on the continent at great scale. So scale's a thing, end of waste is a thing, but also we introduced the plastic packaging tax, but we forgot that we import most of it. Right, so like, there's issues around how we organise the market, right, and how we organise things and how we organise. You'll have seen that I put up a pie chart on LinkedIn about the status of our economy and how much of it sits in services. So it's almost 80% services. If you want a lot of the sort of stuff that we want to happen, i.e. sort of the better use of materials, etc., if you want that to happen and you want it to be powered by renewables and so on and so forth, you do need to reshore a certain amount of manufacturing. And it's not impossible to do. It's I would suggest people, if they think, oh, well, it will cost too much money, it'll be very difficult. I suggest they go and look at like the Inflation Reduction Act in America. So what's the Inflation Reduction Act in America doing that's relevant to this? Well, government is saying that if you invest in green stuff, they will see you for 50% of your cost of capital and around about 10% of your labour costs. Entirely possible. And what I'm trying to get across is all of these things are connected, but we need to start reshoring an amount of that manufacturing capacity, particularly around plastics, and then find a support structure that allows us to get a certain amount of value for those materials to make it a sustainable activity. It's simply looking at the material side of this economy, i.e. polymers and so on, carbon, in the same way as we looked at the energy side maybe a decade ago when we were talking about ROCs and FITs and RHIs. So
we could if we could ban the import of recycled plastics to go into the recycled materials in the plastic tax and have that it only has to come from the UK. Would that work?
All these things are possible. I mean, it's just the fact that we import a lot of finished goods. So we import a lot of finished containers.
Okay.
Yeah. So we import a lot of finished products and finished containers, and we forget that we are 5.5, 6 million people. England's about 60 million people. The continent is far larger, they are integrated, they have free movement of goods, etc., etc. So the economies of scale makes it slightly different. We just have to recognise the difference And you can say, oh, well, you know, the UK is absolutely obsessed with the cost-benefit analysis of things. We are so far past, and it's not just me. You can go and speak to other economists, or, you know, like political economists. We are so far past using cost-benefit analysis as a reasonable measure for what we need to do, because cost-benefit analysis works for, say, you know, do we get a typist, or do we get a photocopier? Do we get, you know, do we get car A or car B? All of that's fine, but neither of those suggest like an unlivable planet. You know, and the other thing is that you need to look at cost benefit analysis on the premise of, is this going to turn the tide of public sentiment? As I say, to go back to the thing that I started with, is this going to turn the tide of public sentiment quite strongly against all the measures that we're trying to implement? And
I think
so
that's the real challenge, Simon, isn't it? Is this behaviour. I keep harking back to, if you can't get people to use a litter bin or a recycling system properly, how on earth are we going to get some of these other things through, especially once it starts costing people money?
Yeah, and so let's talk about that for 2 minutes, because I agree, right? I think it should be possible for people to use the services that are given to them. However, I'm 48 now. I have had quite a chaotic life in certain parts. I live in the local authority region that has the 2 most deprived areas in Scotland. Whether those lives are chaotic through poverty, whether those lives are chaotic simply through having to have more than one job, on occasion more than 2 jobs, whether they're chaotic purely through, I don't know if people have been to Inverclyde, our weather is staggering in terms of how wet it is. Whether it's chaotic, I live in what people would term the posh part, whether it's chaotic through people who are of a middle class or upper middle class income, but they struggle with addiction. There are so many reasons why people don't use the services that are given to them. Now, does that negate the idea that they should be using the services? No, but what we can't have is, we can't have a system where we penalise people, because pay as you throw will never play in Scotland. There's absolutely no chance that pay as you throw will play in Scotland particularly well. Can we incentivise? I remember back in the early days of doing strategic waste fund funding, where we were talking about, I wonder if there is a voucher scheme, a credit scheme, something along those. We don't acknowledge that, and I've said before on the podcast, that we are a very poor country with pockets of very extreme wealth. And we don't recognise it. And our industry, this will sound terrible, but our industry struggles with the tone that we take. I think quite a lot of the time we almost get to the point of saying, well, if people would just live like me, everything would be fine. And that's not the lived experience, and it turns people away quite strongly. But what we could do is recognise that we live in quite a poor place, and look at how we incentivise. How can we incentivise this kind of stuff? Rather than penalising it, how can we incentivise it? You know, so, but I don't disagree. It's, you know, if people can't use the system that's given to them, what chance do we have with everything else? You know, but as I said at the start, any denigration to the standard of living that people have become used to over the last 80 years tends to turn them towards bad ideas.
Oh my goodness, we're all doom and gloom.
Yeah, I know.
I was joking. Yeah, my daughter, right, she's been doing astrobiology, and apparently Venus used to be like us, but it kind of completely collapsed on itself. So there we go. That's why we're trying to move to Mars, apparently.
you touch going back to export bans? I mean, you mentioned export bans as something that is looming. How likely do you think that is? And I suppose it's, in your view, is an export ban for example, plastic, is that a good idea? Because potentially that would allow or encourage investment in that sector.
I think what I would like to see, so I do greenhouse gas emissions and carbon footprints on a semi-regular basis. What we tend to allow in the UK, I mean in Europe as well, but in the UK specifically, is a shortened, easier, less painful version of counting emissions, i.e. we don't include scope 3 a lot of the time. So scope 1 direct, scope 2 indirect, scope 3 supply chain. That's not, the most accurate way of expressing that, but for the sake of speed, let's call it that.
Yeah.
So let's take the emissions of transporting those polymers and include it within the overall emissions. I think you'd probably end up with a completely different situation if you were costing those emissions. The other thing is that Europe has the EU ETS for energy from waste from 2030. So, and it will be introducing slowly the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So it depends where they put energy from waste. If energy from waste is put into electricity production in Europe, then it will be included in the carbon border adjustment mechanism, and you'll need to count all the emissions that come from, say, that imported waste. Perhaps, we don't know yet. But if they do, that's a real knock in the head for RDF, SRF. For those kind of markets, I think that'll be quite problematic, especially if you include the additional price of the carbon. For plastics, it really depends whether you want to continue with this way of looking at the world as a cost-benefit analysis. This is the thing that makes me the most money. If the thing that makes you the most money is the wrong thing to do in terms of the overall economy and the overall sustainability, financial sustainability, political sustainability of what it is that we want to do, you need to introduce either less cost or more revenue to make that the most financially sustainable thing to do. And so I think in the future, do I see these kind of bans forthcoming? I think I do. Do I think they will recognise, and when I say they, I mean not just the politicians, I mean colleagues that sit within non-governmental organisations that seem to be advising, will they advise them that there needs to be a support mechanism? I'm less confident. But that is what needs to happen. I think reshoring domestic manufacturing is not a bad idea. I think it's not a bad idea for the materials that we have. I think it's not a bad idea in terms of saying, okay, we want you to set up this facility. If it's 100% renewable powered, there's a cut to your rates, or there's a cut to your tax, there's a cut to your VAT, whatever it might be. And it provides some level of ongoing sustainable jobs for places that have been heavily deindustrialized, that are currently suffering financially and see additional costs of doing quote unquote green stuff as being quite persecutory to them. I think there's a way of wrapping this story up to make it more intriguing, more positive. How do you not just get what we want in terms of the domestic management of waste to a product, but also brings along those jobs and that confidence?
Yeah, it's that confidence in the market, isn't it? Because we've had this for years. This is going to be happening. This is going to be happening. So you invest in the market, and then it's all of a sudden, right, well, perhaps we'll delay it for a few years. Or, we don't like that answer. Try again until you come up with the answer that we do like. It's, yeah.
Well, it's framing as well. So it's framing how you provide support. So if you want to have more stability in markets, you can create more stability in markets. You can just do price support. And people will say, oh, well, but we're spending money on green stuff. I think that's a bad idea. I've expressed, say, something like district heating schemes. I've expressed it along the lines of, how would you like heat to be delivered to your home in a way that is lower in carbon, not subject to global fluctuations, not subject to global shocks, and allows you to have turn on and offable heat on a 24-hour basis, created domestically just up the road at no additional cost to yourself. And people will say that sounds great. And if you want to go for the Copenhagen model, you could say, and if you're on social security or if you're a pensioner, your price is capped because we're not paying for input fuels, etc., etc., etc. If you frame stuff like that, people are well behind it. If you say, I think the carbon emissions of heat from natural gas are so high, I want to take out your gas boiler, you'll get a very much negative response. Like, framing is really important in all of this. And this is what I'm saying about how we communicate stuff. We're not very good, I don't think, at understanding the context of the world that we sit in. We sit in a world where, we have a high degree of stress on the population from the cost of living. We have a high degree of stress from having essentially left populism and right populism everywhere. People are very upset about almost everything. And then we add on, by the way, because of something that may or may not happen 50 years out, I'm going to engage in an activity that you believe will cost you more money. But the reason it's the right thing to do is because I'm telling you it's the right thing to do. We take quite a technocratic sort of data view of things and say, okay, well, the data says this. As we previously discussed, people don't work like that. People work in folk models in their head. Large groups of people work on sentiment. They don't work on data.
Yeah, the number of times, Simon, I've had conversation with people about climate change, and they're, it's not true, it's not happening, it's not this, it's not that.
Mm-hmm.
And the number of times I said to them, well, okay, that might be what you believe, but do you actually really think we're living sustainably at the moment? Do you think we're looking after resources? Do you think we're looking after nature? Do you think we're doing all these, things? And generally the answer to that is no. And I said, well, forget about climate change. You can say you don't believe in it, but actually what are you doing about trying to improve what you're actually doing yourself? And when you turn it back around at them like that, they actually, they're a bit more positive about it all.
Yeah, and you can just when I say throw money at it, with people up in arms kind of going like, oh, but we've got a cost of living crisis and the national debt is this size and debt to GDP is like this. Listen, post-war period, debt to GDP was like 160%. Why? Because they were throwing money at stuff. Throwing money. What was their big concern at the time? Big concern at the time was that there was a shortage of literally everything. And there was a real risk of people going back to populism politics post-war because there was a depression. And so we threw money at stuff because that was the big issue of the day. All I'm saying is that this is the big issue of the day, and we seem to want to implement things on a cost-benefit analysis where the public has to pay for it. And it's no surprise to me that people start to believe folk models of, if you go to the Republicans, what are the Republicans in America saying just now? They are saying that it's natural cycles, that these are natural cycles. And given the way that social media works and given what pops up on your timeline and how often that pops up on your timeline, these things start to get believed.
So how do we, as an industry, we've touched on quite a lot of topics. We've touched on ETS, we've touched on plastics, we've touched on carbon, we've touched on extended producer responsibility, DRS, all these different, we've got loads, as a sector, we've got loads of different things that are all having, we've got landfill tax, we've got landfill ban, we've got all these different things, all playing their part and influence in the sector. Is there somebody really that's got this all in their head and understanding the implications of each. Or, to me, it feels a bit like DRS. It's like, oh, we'll do a DRS because public quite like DRS, so that's okay to do. Extended producer's responsibility, that's the producer's going to pay for that, so we'll do that, because they'll pay for it. Do you think there's anybody really got an understanding of the implications of these things and how it's going to change the whole dynamic?
Well, that's difficult for me to answer. So the way I frame it, because the reason it's difficult for me to answer, by the way, people might not know if they are from other parts of the UK or overseas. You might not know what people from the west of Scotland are like. We can't have any form of a positive view of ourselves or our abilities. So if I was maybe from somewhere else, I could say, yes, it's what I'm currently working on. But the reality is that nobody else is interested. So you have to do it on your own dime. I've framed it as something along the following. Over the last decade, we have been harvesting different ingredients for a casserole, and we have no idea how the casserole tastes yet. We are putting all this stuff together, and we have no idea how it tastes, particularly to those people who have to, for reasons that are unknown to me, have to be the ones that are responsible for delivering everything. We have, for whatever reason, decided that local authorities are the best vehicle to deliver all the climate change mitigation activity to do with waste. And you can say, oh, but I'm a energy from waste provider, an AD provider, or a PERF or whatever, and I've invested my money. I know you have, but you've hung all of it on contracts with local authorities. There are some private waste providers in there, like the BIFAs, like the Viriders, like these guys. Yeah. But predominantly, where does most of the waste come from? Most of the waste comes from households. And we've decided to give the challenge to the local authorities. There is no local authority anywhere in the UK that understands the full implications for its budget, its services, its targets, etc., from the interaction between, if you want more money, you have to have this type of collection scheme. If you don't have this type of collection scheme, it won't deliver on the targets. How does that interact with EPR? How does it interact with DRS? How much is going to be left in the bin? Therefore, how much ETS money are you going to have to pay? And you've got your budget cuts, etc., etc., etc. It has to give somewhere. And the thing that I've been trying to work on is, where does it leave us? Does it leave us at a point where we can actually get to, if you engage in 1 or 2 or 3 activities, you can be kind of more cost neutral about things? Or do we end up in a situation where you're either going to have to throw new burden funding at a local authority, or the local authority is going to have to find some way of charging householders? And like I say, my main concern is that we're turning people against us as opposed to towards us with some of these policies. So yeah, the answer is no. I don't think anybody knows how the casserole tastes. I have reason to believe from the work that I've done already that it tastes pretty sour. But if I can make a pitch, I'd love to do it. I'd love to do it, but nobody's interested.
See, I don't think, thinking about local authority, and I don't want to talk down local authority colleagues, but I think, if they're sitting in a council and their tender's about to expire in a year's time, their priority is to secure a tender and secure a disposal route for that material. Mm-hmm. The impact and climate change and carbon and all these things is, I would suggest, pretty low down the agenda and what they're trying to achieve. Now, there will be words to that effect and about carbon and climate change in the contract, but at the end of the day, the reality is they need a disposal route for that material. Otherwise, they've got a serious problem.
Yeah, so as a tenderer, if you go for a residual contract, you've got to put in a carbon action management plan. So you've got to say how much carbon will be emitted and how you're going to mitigate that over time as the tenderer, as the facility. And there is a small amount of the appraisal of the tenders that's related to carbon. However, I haven't seen anything yet that reflects the best practice down south, where the enormous spike in energy prices realised a £10 million payback for one of the authorities in England. Right? I also don't want to talk down any local authority, because I think they've got just an impossible job. An impossible job. I mean, basically, what we're saying now for Scottish local authorities is you've been given no money to deliver all targets to do with waste. And also, if I am SG, Zero Waste Scotland, SEPA, whoever, I'm going to permanently put up hurdles for no real reason. I mean, there's no, as we discussed in the last podcast, if you look at all the papers that have been produced and all the sort of, best practice that's been produced and the charter stuff and everything else, it's delivered like 2% in a decade in the recycling rate. It's not really it's performative. There's no real function in there. But local authorities have been told, you're going to be responsible for targets. Even though we're going to take the material out at DRS, we're going to, you're still responsible for targets. But they do need support. They need more support now than they ever have done. And I think the type of support that they're getting is not enough, because in order to deliver the kind of services that they need to deliver, they need money more than anything else. And let's be honest, as you say, the ambition is to get a contract at a reasonable price. But there are measures in there, as have been evidenced down in England, that could deliver real benefits in terms of finance when they come to renegotiation.
I think it was it was interesting. Interesting you're saying that, Simon. Sheila Best was very much about that, about the infrastructure they had to work with in terms of the local authority. That aging facilities, needing upgrade, needing real cash spent in them, and there's not really been a sort of review of the infrastructure across Scotland for handling waste.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I completely agree. I mean, what I think is happening is that we're trying to deliver an idea that is in a report or in a spreadsheet of a type of service that we can't afford. Like I say, the interesting bit to me about this casserole that we've been putting together is that nowhere have all the elements of the casserole been taken and said, okay, how does this demand align with the finance and the expectations of finance of the people that are supposed to deliver it?
I think that's always going to be the thing, is it? It's the integration of all of these things. It's just people don't talk to each other and work out the big picture, really.
Yeah, and also the type of work that we're trying to do, the type of work that we are pushing forward in our institutions is nothing to do with this.
Yeah,
it's nothing to do with any of it. I am entirely sympathetic and entirely in favour of having a analysis undertaken on whether the industry is fair, or whether the industry engages in full representation, or whether the industry has a taxonomy that everyone can agree with, but all of these sorts of things. But at the same time, it's an industry that has aging infrastructure, no money available to the people who are supposed to deliver the services, and mass additional cost coming down the line. And so I mean, you were saying earlier, Jane, that this is all fairly downbeat and depressing. I think it's the opposite, right? I think there's an opportunity just now to look at things and say, okay, we need to revisit a lot of this, and in the real world, what is it that we need to do, and how much money do we need to raise in order to do it? Does it mean more authorities need to work together, partnerships? Is that the answer? We've got 32 authorities. There are arguments to have more authorities.
It's called the area waste plan, Simon.
Yeah, well, so we go back to that. But But I think a lot of the work that we're doing, if you look at a lot of the published work of the agencies that are involved, has no relevance to the delivery of services or the delivery of infrastructure. But that's what costs money, and that's what saves money and generates revenue. And that's the important thing just now. Because if it starts to cost too much money, you'll find people to just turn against you.
So who
I think we
drives that?
definitely, yeah, but I think we need to leave this on a positive note, Simon, because we've been speaking now for quite a long time. And, you know, we've talked about money, we've talked about this, we've talked about politics, we've talked about who we could talk again for another hour and a half. But I think we must leave it on a positive note. Do you not think?
Listen, you're speaking to the wrong guy.
He's West Coast miserable.
I was expecting Alison to come in there.
Listen, this is so. If I have one complaint about the industry, is that is I don't disagree with you. I know what you mean, right? And I'm honestly sympathetic to the idea. We have to leave things in a positive. However, I go to conferences, and every conference tells us that everything's going well and everybody should be happy, right?
Yeah.
And we've had that for the last decade. And in that decade, the authorities have become poorer, the services have become more difficult to provide, the infrastructure hasn't been replaced, and the recycling rate has been sclerotic at best.
Okay.
There is as I've said previously on the previous podcast, I've said in some writings as well, the level of like what I call toxic positivity that follows us around in the industry, that things are going well, they're not going well, and they're about to get significantly worse. So I would love to sit here and say that I think that you know that there is a real good news story somewhere in all of this. At present, I struggle to find where the good news story is, and I did say at the start, I'm really worried.
Yeah,
and I'm really worried
that's fair. Yeah.
I'm really worried because I think, like I say, we do things in isolation and we don't see what the net effect of everything is. And I would advise people, just go and have a look at Europe. Go and have a look at political sentiment in Europe. Go and have a look at the people that are doing well, because you and I can sit here and say, well, that's not got anything to do with it. Unfortunately, the politics delivers the targets, delivers the infrastructure, delivers the funding for everything. And what you're seeing across Europe, who are years ahead of us, remember, in the delivery of some of this stuff, is that public sentiment is not particularly high for what it is that we want to do. And I think we need to find a way in Scotland. You know, we're a small country. We all know each other really well. I think we can get our heads together and find a way to deliver what it is we want to deliver in a way that's positive and captures positive public sentiment.
Okay.
I do agree there, Simon. Because I was at the SRC conference this year, and a number of, if you like, officials from government agencies that, you know, there's a mention of we need to be positive, and that was almost a mantra. And you sit there and think, well, we're not actually doing that great with some of this stuff. That, you know, I would much rather have people, and there were certainly presentations from, I think it was Veronica from Highland, and I think Sheila as well, Sheila Best, and they posted up and said, look, this is what's happening, this is what we've got, this is what we've done and that was much more positive, being open and honest and saying, you know, this is the issue we've got, this is how we've tried to address it, and this is how we want to try and move forward, rather than being really positive and pretending there's not a problem.
I agree, and if I want to go for full 100% career suicide, when people say we need to be positive for who? Positive for who? If you're in charge of organisations that are at the top of the tree, and this is what you've delivered, this is the environment that you've delivered. Positive for who?
So taking it forward into 24 in a positive, how do we change that? How do we change that dynamic? As you said, there are other people in Scotland that know this stuff, they understand this stuff, they do want to see change in the right direction. How do we change that dynamic?
Is this your magic wand for 2024?
Well, I think that's what I'm leading on to. You can have,
yeah,
you can have a magic wand for 2024.
Okay, a magic wand for 2024. I think we need a better vehicle for getting our ideas across. There are lots of people, and there's people way ahead of me, by the way. I mean, I am, you know, the runt of the litter with regards to this kind of stuff. You know, like folk like John Ferguson up at Bin and whatever. These guys are well in advance of what I'm talking about. But the reality is if we want to do stuff, if we want to find policies and measures, activities that are more in line with the lived experience, I think there's more we could do through COSLA. I think COSLA could be a lot stronger on this kind of stuff. I think the Chartered Institute is phenomenally weak. There's a real reason why I'm not a member of the Chartered Institute anymore, because I think it doesn't really have a function in terms of trying to have a debate about opinion. It just follows whatever the sort of government opinion is. And I think we need to, we discussed having a different kind of platform in terms of our national conference as well. To have a more open and honest discussion that can then pass forward recommendations at the end of it, having plenaries, having seminars, getting ideas across, voting, having a cast vote that allows us to get across a majority of opinion that we need this. We need X, Y, and Z. We need to renege on this policy, but we can do this. We can't achieve that, but we can achieve this. We can't deliver this, but here's an alternative. We don't have any forums to do this. It's very master slave in terms of how we accept policy programs that, let's be fair, are not particularly well researched, not particularly well written. I haven't seen anything coming out over the last 8-9 years that you're not able to poke holes in within sort of like 20-30 minutes, you know, and that's really to do with how we recruit people in to do this kind of work. It's just not, it's not good enough, it's not strong enough, and the industry isn't strong enough because we don't have the representation. I think we just need to do it ourselves.
Okay, is that the three of us, Simon? Sorted.
It's our new job.
Let's sort out the yeah. Anyway, I think that's a good thing for 2024.
That's what I want to see.
Difficult one to achieve, or it might not be. Depends on the will of the people, I suppose.
Well, to me, it depends on the will of CIWM. If CIWM want to continue on with an annual event where basically it's a lot of backslapping and a lot of glad handing, and we don't actually achieve anything out of the whole thing, and then we all go for a drink and then we go home and everything runs on year after year the same, that's fine. But that's not the role of a Chartered Institute.
I suppose it's being honest, isn't it, about what's actually happening and what we need to do about it, rather than...
So we are the industry, right? Government is not the industry. And the regulator actually isn't the industry either. We are the industry. And we just don't have a collective forum to say, actually, no, this is going to be impossible. What we've got is a series of consultations that are very short time periods for a very stressed workforce where all the information is not made available to them. And the questions are capped questions. So you can't get across your point of view accurately enough. And then it's like, oh, well, 20% of you said that you would go for this. Yeah, because I didn't realise that this was the implication of it. Right? We need a better forum. And I think if the Chartered Institute wants to do something productive, it could possibly start having a look at taking its role more seriously, engaging the opinion of the actual industry and delivering back to government, delivering back to Zero Waste Scotland, delivering back to SEPA, delivering back to Westminster, This is possible, this isn't possible. This can be delivered, but at this cost. We're not going to engage in this because we simply don't have the money for it. Can't ask individual authorities or individual companies to do that. You know, it's just not possible. So I think if I could have a sort of, you know, magic wand for that, it would be that.
There we go. I think that's an excellent one, Simon. So I think we've probably chatted well over what we've planned. So hopefully that wasn't too painful for you, Simon. I think it's probably let you get some stuff off your chest, actually. But
listen,
it's always a good rant, isn't it?
Well, it's the cheapest therapy that's available.
Perfect.
But I think it's important that these things that are coming down the line, and the scale of them, the size of them, the implications of them, are taken on board.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and it was really, really interesting listening to you talking about it and all the implications that I'd not thought about or thought through in that really wide context as well. When you're looking at politics, you're looking at infrastructure, you're looking at exports, you're looking at Europe, you know, it's like, right, okay, I can see how it all fits in, or doesn't fit in, as the case may be.
Yeah, and I'll leave you with this. I mean, there's everyone likes a good story. The gym that I use, and people will be surprised when they see me to know that I go to a gym, but the gym that I use is so mixed. It has every SIMD in that gym. And as you may know, I talk to everybody all the time, regardless where I am. I travel to London for the football every 2 weeks. I talk to absolutely everybody. I talk to everybody here because I find it interesting. When we had the thing about the heat pumps and the electric cars and everything else, you would think that will be a proportion of people who think it's a bad idea because they don't believe in it, a proportion of people who think that it's a good idea because they do believe in it, and a proportion of people who think it's a good idea just because it sounds cool. Overwhelmingly, everybody in that gym thought it was terrible. And the reason that they thought it was terrible was nothing to do with the policies, nothing to do with understanding the implications or anything else. They just hate the Greens.
Okay.
And they think that, right? And they think that everybody in the Green Party is a technocratic, condescending, middle class person, right? Now that's not true. Obviously not true, right? But none of the people in that gym were planning to engage in any way with any of these policies and would actively vote against it. Nothing to do with the policy, nothing to do with the technical outcome, nothing to do with the data, nothing to do with anything else. It's just their folky impression in their heads of what a certain other group of people are like and why they're being asked to do things. All I'm saying is that exists.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And no matter what we do as a technical sector, we need to be able to translate it into things that garner that folky level of support, not that folky level of antipathy.
Well, that's exactly why we started the podcast, Simon, because my firm view was that there was a total lack of understanding about everything that happens in the waste sector by the vast majority of the general public. And if nothing else, what we've been trying to do is share the sort of experience and knowledge of people that work in the sector, just to show how complex it is, and hopefully give people a bit more of an understanding of what we need to try and do.
And I think you're doing that. I think it's great. But I think you're doing that. But as we said before, you know, honesty is required within it as well for ourselves, not just everybody else. What do they say? Sunlight's the best disinfectant, something along those lines. Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah,
anyway, I think we're better end now. So thank you for being so accommodating with your time and sharing your knowledge. Your knowledge is vastly in excess of ours, Simon, and we do view you as a bit of an expert in this subject. So you can take your you can start your West Coast blush for getting a compliment there. So
Thank you so much. Pleasure to speak to you.
Yes.